Society of the Snow is founded in Uruguay's Montevideo. October of 1972. The rugby squad from Old Christians Club is engaged in a fierce contest with some of their competitors on the field. Roberto Matias Recalt, a junior player, grabs hold of the rugby ball and dashes with all his strength, defying commands and shouts from the captain and other senior players to transfer it to teammates. Roberto's valiant efforts are in vain since the opposition players tackle him shortly after, and the outcome of the little play is identical to the game's outcome. Even though the Old Christian Club loses badly, there isn't a particularly depressing vibe in the locker room. This is a result of the young men's intense excitement for a forthcoming match, which will take place in Chile, a neighboring country. For this reason, taking the companions on an international match is an exciting possibility that resembles an exciting adventure. 40 people board the aircraft, including 5 crew members and 19 rugby players from the Old Christians Club, as it departs Uruguay normally. Numa joined his friends on the trip while pursuing his legal studies. Fido, Eduardo, and Daniel are cousins. Everything is okay until halfway through the trip, when the passengers start taking pictures of one another, and the kids create a happy attitude that permeates the whole thing. But as the plane approaches the Andes mountain range, the weather quickly shifts, with snow and gusty winds creating severe turbulence that makes the flying extremely difficult. The flight path necessitates a detour to circumvent the tall mountains and instead traverse the comparatively more expansive pass situated between 2 mountains. This is the point at which the aircraft crashes into the snow-covered Andes due to the pilots losing control of the aircraft. While some of the passengers, later confirmed to number 12, died in the crash, the others had to start a protracted and arduous wait for assistance. Day 1st of October, 13, 1972. Sadly, the pilot perished in the collision within minutes, and communications between the survivors and the outside world were severed along with all of the damaged equipment. A few of the men attempted to communicate with someone via the pilot's radio, but the device was unable to function due to a lack of power. The tail of the plane came off after the crash and shot off, causing it to break into 2 parts upon landing on the heavily snow-covered slopes. Right from the first night of their suffering, the survivors learned that the best way to stay warm was to huddle close to the remains of the deceased. Because of the circumstances, it only took a few minutes for the temperature to drastically drop after dark. The survivors spent the first few days praying that assistance was on its way because the airplane's damaged front section served as a shelter. The dead bodies are placed outside in the snow after the survivors tidy the aircraft to make room for them. It had become public knowledge that Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 had vanished, and the authorities had begun their search for its remains. Although the survivors could hear jets flying past, they were unable to identify the planes from the skies above due to the crash site. The precise location being at a difficult angle to trace assured that neither the accident site nor the survivors could be noticed by the rescue planes, in addition to the heavy snowfall that buried almost everything on the ground. The severe cold plus the fact that each of them was injured in some way made the wait for assistance agonizingly painful, with only very minimal first aid provided during that time. The food issue was the worse, though, as there was not enough food to go around for everyone in the group. The group's modest supply of food, which consisted mainly of chocolates, ran out quickly after the suitcase was discovered, and they didn't get access to any more until much later. The area was uninhabited because of the intense cold and lack of any living things, including vegetation. In their rather delirious state, some were convinced that the place was not meant for any life, for there was no means to support it. The survivors, however, were forced to cling to this area in order to maintain their lives, as the surrounding snow prevented them from moving far. The expedition is unable to get too far from their starting point as Numa searches for the tail of the plane that crashed on the other side of the mountain. In addition, the team discovers that the plane is already invisible halfway up the mountain. The survivors eventually forced to accept the most despised means of subsistence, cannibalism. After trying to consume inedible items like seat foam and leather, the survivors could find nothing nearly as edible as the dead bodies laying around, with all their flesh going to waste. Many also ingested their own skin, which was peeling off due to numerous illnesses and malnourishment, although it was insufficient for sustenance. Many people objected to the idea of eating the flesh of their deceased friends and fellow travelers for a variety of moral and religious reasons when it was first brought up. In addition to the abhorrent idea of consuming human flesh, eating human flesh is always regarded as a sin by religious authorities, and as a result, others choose not to participate. However, there was also a more serious issue with permission because none of the deceased passengers would have approved of such a disrespectful treatment of their bodies. On the 8th day, Nando's sister Susana, Alfonsina Carroccio, also passes away from starvation and the cold. Eventually, the survivors' insatiable hunger and unrelenting will to survive took control, forcing them to devour human flesh in order to preserve their lives. The Strauch cousins spearheaded the most humanitarian arrangements imaginable, and the person tasked with chopping the meat into manageable chunks and servings never revealed who the bodies they had to use were. In the end, as more perilous days passed with no assurance or chance of assistance from the outside world, the survivors consented to allow one another to utilize their bodies in the afterlife in order to survive. The idea of eating the meat with heaps of snow in order to avoid the taste still creeped out a lot of people. It was no easy feat to survive for 72 days in the desolate, snow-covered Andes. The crew had set up a homemade radio to stay informed of any rescue operations in the area and had been successful in salvaging electronic parts from another crash site during this time. This, however, only served to increase their disappointment, as they learned that rescue efforts had been discontinued and that no organization had been able to locate them in the Andes. Near the other crash site, Numa discovers the dead bodies of Ramon Martinez, Ovidio Ramirez, Alexis Halney, Daniel Shaw, and Guido Magri, as well as Gaston Costamao, Luda. This depressing news was coupled by even more catastrophic weather changes. Avalanches and snowstorms smothered the airplane, burying it deep beneath the earth. As a result, numerous other persons passed away. The dead people within the fuselage are forced to be eaten by the survivors, who are still buried under the snow. Due to their physical state, some of the rugby team friends chose to hike great distances in quest of assistance, while others were forced to wait for the authorities to continue their search. 4 of the men, Roberto, Nando, Tintin, and Numa, left the scene on the 36th day following the disaster, thinking they could hike through the mountain ranges and eventually arrive in Chile, which was situated directly behind the tall Andes Mountains. Because of a terrible illness on his foot from a previous injury, Numa had to abandon his trip right from the start and head back to the flight. Once they returned to the plane, Rafael El Vasco Echeverrin, Benjamin Segura, and Arturo Noguera, Fernando Contigiani Garcia, pass away from the cold and the virus. The 3 that were still traveling continued, and at some point they discovered the airplane's damaged tail. The 3 returned with supplies for the remaining group from the tail. Over the course of the following few days, the gang attempted to establish communication with civilization by utilizing the power retrieved from the tail. More dangerous snowstorms and unfavorable weather were also endured by them. There were still 17 crash survivors as of November 29. Tintin snaps photos of the living. In the end, the others chose to travel back east when their dear buddy Numa, who was also very liked by the group, departed on December 11, 1972. By now, winter had passed and the light was rising higher in the sky every day, allowing Roberto, Nando, and Tintin to set out on foot in the direction of their far-off goal. The group hiked miles through the Argentinian side of the Andes range, encountering strong winds and snowfall along the way. But Expedition East was not simply an impractical scheme certain to fail. The jet had fallen not too far from the area that borders Argentina and Chile. Rather, after reaching the top of the mountain range, the 3 guys were able to see the broad valley below, which was undoubtedly Chile and inhabited land beyond. From this point on, Tintin went back to the accident site to monitor the food supplies, while Roberto and Nando continued with their original goal to locate any assistance for the group of survivors. The lizard that Roberto and Nando unexpectedly come across suggests that they had finally arrived in a place where life existed. Roberto is confused by a different scene as Nando is absorbed in staring at the life form. A lone man on horseback is staring at them confusedly. After the two men introduced themselves and spoke with the villagers swiftly, the man led them back to the village. They requested assistance in being rescued and a communication transmitted to the Chilean authorities from this location. On December 22, 1972, Mando and Roberto finally made their way out of the Chilean village. Shortly after, the police showed up, and media representatives flocked to take pictures of them and publicize the incredible news of their survival. The other survivors, who were still trapped at the accident site, were informed by the same news that was broadcast on the radio that assistance would be arriving shortly. The men eagerly awaited, making the most of their appearance and hairstyle, well aware that the press would be there as well and that their images would be featured on the pages of every daily for several days. Rescue helicopters eventually flew over the scene, saving the survivors from certain death. One of the survivors very adamantly refused to be removed until he was let to carry his luggage, which in fact held a number of items that belonged to the deceased. These items, which their families would fervently desire to own in remembrance of them, were their final remnants. Men banded together, supporting and encouraging one another, and many developed a renewed belief in human decency and humanity's ability to triumph over supernatural forces.